How's it going, guys? It was a nice opening. Thank you, Max and Lars. So today we'll start off with an interesting topic, I think, NgRx. Who of you heard of NgRx before? Okay. Who of you are using NgRx? Great. It's a lot of people. That's definitely more than I usually see. Usually it's like 60%, but a lot of people hear about it. So let me again reintroduce myself. So I'm Okrushko. I grew up in Kharkiv. Anybody from Kharkiv here? Yay! So right now I work as a software engineer at Google. I work on a Firebase console. I recently became part of the NgRx core team, announced at NGConf this year. And I also happy to be Angular in-depth writer and reviewer. That's what I do in my free time with our in-depth community. All right, so first, before we go into the topic, where should we use NgRx, I'd like to start with a little story. Again, this is my story with NgRx. And it all started in January of 2017. This is when I joined the Firebase team. I used to be at Google Fiber before that. So I was very excited to join this new team. And right away, I got a very, very interesting task almost immediately. And to help me with my story and my task, I'll have something that I would call a sentiment graph. So in my opinion, how I see people, like their attitude towards NgRx, how they feel about NgRx. And in 2017, and early 2017, the library was already getting popular. I would say, something 30% people knew it and people liked it. So my first task in the Firebase console was in-console notification system. And this is where you have, oops, hold on, here you go, do it every time. Again, there you go. So this is that bell thing. So those when new notifications come for the Firebase, new alerts, we have a bell that shows, a red dot and it's pulsing. And the task is very interesting because those alerts are coming with the poll. So every so often we get new data. And whenever we get new data, we show that icon. But not only that, the user can also interact with them. For example, they can open the sidebar and see what notifications they have. They can interact with there, they can dismiss them as well. That means this is the same data that user can act on as well. And not all alerts are equal as well. Some alerts are what we call urgent alerts, and they are displayed right away. So that means that incoming data stream that we get, it also has to be split in different ways, and if it's an urgent alert, then we have to show it right away. So this is where I first met NgRx, and it fit perfectly into the tasks that I needed to solve. So I was very happy about that. And from that moment, at that moment, it was like NgRx all the things, right? They changed everything to wire up NgRx instead. However, at that time, Dan Abramov already published his article, Why You Might Not Need NgRx. Yes, actually, Redux, Why You Might Not Need Redux. But the items that he listed were almost like a mild marketing material why you actually need it, right? For example, it was using like time travel debugging, and it was, hey, you have the entire list of actions that you can easily replay and get to the same state consistently. Of course I want all of that, right? And so I completely ignored any of the warnings or, yeah. So, and then we see our graph, I feel it peaks at NgConf of 2018. That was last year's NgConf, where the entire day, for the entire day, one of the days, they had a solely dedicated for the NgRx. The entire track was NgRx topics. So everyone was very excited about this. But this library, NgRx, I also, almost when I got it in, I started maintaining at Google. And more teams started using it within Google. And more feedback I was getting that, it might be a little bit too much for things that specific team need. Maybe it has a little bit too many moving parts. And I think in the external community, it was also already, starting that. And for example, Mike Ryan, who's one of the creators of NgRx as well, he already at that time had his famous public talk, which is, you might not need NgRx. Because he saw that people tend to get very excited and start overusing the technology for places where, well, there's no need for it. Where it could be an overkill. So after that, more articles followed, right? And more articles followed. Some of the community leaders already started saying, hey, it might be too much for their use cases. Not every app is an enterprise app that has a lot of interesting scenarios. And I feel it almost culminated at this year's NgConf, where they had a talk that was actually taken down, where they gave an advice to the community that understand before you adopt it. And the other advice was like, don't use Redux like ketchup. And this is very great advice, actually. And I actually 100% agree with this. So, where do we go from now? It takes us to the present days. What do we do? Where does NgRx go? How do we feel about this? Well, my personal opinion is that the message about overuse or improper use of NgRx is getting across quite well, if not more. And I think that with extra guidance and extra information, we can turn it a little bit around and stabilize it and have a proper usage, healthy usage with a proper growth. And what makes me so hopeful about this? Well, US researcher Charles Roy Amara has his Amara law that he created. And what he's stating in this law is that we tend to overestimate the effect of the technology in the short run, but underestimate it in the long run. This is what depicted in the Gartner's hype cycle. So we start, using any technology with the big hype. It peaks. And then we get disappointed with this. And it has a large drop. And then it overcorrects and finally gets to proper healthier growth. And we've seen it before, actually. We've seen it before with NoSQL databases. We saw this happening in the microservices world. And probably the biggest example of all is the internet itself. Some of you might remember or at least read about the .com bubble and .com crisis. There, when everybody jumped on the technology and the internet was a new hot thing with a hype, then it had the bubble burst. and now we're where we are right now with the healthy internet that we have right now. So let me bring back the sentiment graph that I had for NgRx. This is what makes me hopeful about this technology. So from this intro, I tried to draw 3 conclusions. First of all, learn the technology. There's nothing wrong with learning new technologies. Always learn it. But understand its use cases. Where it should be used, where it shouldn't be used. And of course, sometimes it's not like clear right away, like, oh, we should use for this, we shouldn't use for that. It's a process. But to help with that process, you have to be asking questions. Ask questions to yourself. Ask questions to any team members. Discuss it. Ask questions in the community. Why do we need it? Be critical with the critical thinking. So, that leads us to the topic of this talk. To use NgRx or not to use NgRx. As I said already before, NgRx is not necessarily NgRx or nothing. It can actually be mixed with a service-based approach quite well. And in some cases, as I'll show today, service-based approach is something that I would actually recommend more. But what is NgRx? Anybody knows? It's a state management library, right? But what is state? And what are we managing, right? To understand why we need it or not need it, let's first understand what the state is. What is state? And in preparation for this talk, I spent lots and lots of time trying to formalize those thoughts, trying to find any resource possible that would tell me what the state is. And a lot of what state is was quite outdated, getting back to, pre-one-page applications. So some of it would be, the best resource that I found that reflects my thinking about this was actually a Viktor Savskin article, which I highly recommend to read. So a lot of it would be based on that as well. So we start with the server state. The server state is something that it's all the data that's stored on the server side, right? This is our main source of truth. So when we type in the URL, we go to the server to fetch some of the data. We get HTML back, of course, to display the page, but we get some of the data back. And we assume we're dealing with RESTful services, so servers not keeping state of who's talking to them. And that state that we get back from the server, we get a small chunk for what we need, not all entire state from the server, just for what we need, and we call it a persisted state. So the state that we got from server, that persisted state, small chunk of the actual state. So when we start interacting with our page, for example, selecting the project here, or clicking the filter, filtering by something, like for example, if it's a store application, filtering by, books. We get into something that's called the client state. So this state, it lives on the client only. We don't communicate to the backend that we do this. For example, here, we selected the project. This will be our new client state. We are basing off on the previous data that we got. But client state, or at least good client state, as well as persistent state, should be reflected in the URL, right there. And that brings us a fourth type of state. It's the URL state, or sometimes also called the router state. Those four states are quite important, and I'll show a little bit later why. But apart from that, we also have a local UI state, or sometimes called local component state. This is the state that's not persistent to the server, does not play in the global application, it's not shared within the application. It's each component has it for itself. For example, if we, the state of is our drop-down open or not, that component has its state. It's called the local UI state. Okay. We also have a local browser state, which is for the local storage when we interact with that. And that state is not persistent in the backend, but it still plays a role within the browser. So if we open it, we can always see, for example, here we save some of the key value pairs. And the final state is a transient state. So it's not reflected in the URL. It's kind of part of the client state, but again, it's not reflected in the URL, and this is what separates it. It has a very temporary nature. So it lives only within the same app or even within a session of the browser. For example, if I share this URL with somebody else, right, they might have their own transient state and they won't get what I had. Okay, so that's, this one. So that's a lot of state. What's the problem with this? What do we need to manage? Remember those first four that I showed? This is the biggest challenge what we have. Managing server state with a persistent state, URL state, and client state. Because they all interact with each other, and how we sync those states is the most important question that we should be asking in our web applications, especially if we want it to be very interactable. All right, so before we go a little bit deeper there, I'll go over what the NgRx is, just to highlight, but you all might know, so it's no surprise for you here. So what's NgRx in a nutshell? I'll do very quickly then. So we have a store at the core of it. It's an immutable object of all of the shared state of our application. And that shared state is the client state and persistent state. Sometimes transient state could be also part of it. To change, it's immutable, so to change anything there, we need a reducer, right? It takes the slice of state that it's responsible for, it takes one of the actions and modifies that global store. But to interact with this, our components have to dispatch those actions. So they do that, and it goes into the mainstream of actions. And to close the loop, we have selectors that select some of the state from the store, could be deriving it as well on the way and providing it to the component. Component here could still have their local state and it's not involved in this. To communicate to the backends, we have something that's, we have effects. So this is where side effects happen, or we try to push anything async in that. So they talk to the backends, get back action of success or failure usually, and push into the mainstream of actions. All right, so the first, I'm trying to speed up a little bit. So first solution is, let's have our stateless services all together. That means that all the synchronization that we do between our states is synchronous. But that means that for any request that we do, we have to wait for the server to respond, and we have no cache whatsoever. Here's a comparison with and without cache, for example. You can see how the one on the right is a lot more like interactive. But that solves all the problems. We don't need to manage any state. We don't need any NgRx. But we would have a subpar UX experience. So obviously we need to keep that state somewhere and to have it more interactive, our web applications. And one of the solutions is to have either stateful services or NgRx or a mixture of both. Well, stateful services that idea sounds really nice, right? Our component talks to the service talks to the backend. It has some cache. If we need that data again, our service provides it for us. UI is responsive. Awesome. And that works well if your service is very, the responsibility of that service is very narrow. For example, it's responsible for, terms of service dialog. It just does the request, does it need it, does it not? It's very narrow, it doesn't talk to other services. It works great. And in that case, I really suggest stateful service to use it. Don't use NgRx. But from my experience, the larger the app grows, the more it becomes like this. Yay! This is what I call a service soup. And to be fair, and I've talked to a few of you already before, and a lot more discussions on Twitter, some teams actually manage to have a lot of stateful services, and they manage to structure their app in a proper way that they interact with each other. So it might be not as a soup, but it's still working architecture. And I really commend to you, that's great. But it's very hard to do when there's a large team of people working on a large application. So that structure has to be for some other way. And actually, a lot of those services would be like behavior subject-based caches. And a lot of times they would have like a scan operator, they have this thing until change, they have maps, and all those nice things. And again, you might know that this is actually the underlying architecture of the NgRx itself. For example, as Rob Walmart, who actually created this, he created NgRx, first version of NgRx over the weekend, and that was 70 lines of code. Obviously, it grew past that to accommodate different scenarios, add side effects, and all that. Okay, so we know now we need to have cache, either stateful services with a cache, or help NgRx manage that. But what about NgRx and the forms? Do we need NgRx with the forms? Well, in most cases, no. And let's look at a few scenarios. First of all is async validations. So for example, we type something in the form, we don't push it to the store, we don't dispatch actions on every interaction. Because form control by itself is a great container of a local state, right? It doesn't have to be shared. It's self-contained within that. So async validation, even though it does do the network calls sometimes, it's completely fine to just have a service that does that call, comes back and provides the data to the form itself. Where we might start involving NgRx is actually submitting the form data if that data needs to be part of the global application shared state. Otherwise, if your form is also responsible not sharing that results of that form with the rest of the application, don't even bother putting NgRx as well there. So one other thing is, do we need to put NgRx in the shared components? Well, the answer here is most likely no. But we shouldn't be putting much of the services there as well, because shared components should be interacting with their container components via inputs and outputs. And then the container components, it's their decision. Should they be using stateful services, or should they be using NgRx instead? All right, so there are a few more interesting use cases for NgRx, like complex UI interactions, flow incoming data, which is actually it excels in, right? For example, you have a button that emits, you can do the service call on the button click. But what if you click multiple times and the previous one's still busy? Do you invoke a new one? Do you not invoke the new one? Do you do the network request? Do you drop it? So this is something that NgRx handles very well with the side effects, because we can control the flow of those actions. Concurrent data modifications, that's what I started with. where, for example, you have a polling of the backend and you have user interacting with the same data. To have a nice sync that's predictable, NgRx is perfect for that. And frequently changing state, again, NgRx is really, really shining there with their memorization. So today I showed you a few examples where NgRx shines or where you should actually not use it. And those can coexist perfectly fine within a healthy application. So I hope you learned something from it, and now we can have a more healthier debates about NgRx or not NgRx. Thank you. One last thing, I have a workshop today where I'll be showing some of the optimistic UI techniques. So if you're interested in that with NgRx, please welcome.